The debate over a future border poll is well advanced within nationalism, but will unionists even engage with the discussion? Welcome to The View. Tonight, nationalism is confident and energised about the prospect of a border poll in the near future. But how do unionists feel about the prospect? We hear from an author who believes unionists must be willing to promote the status quo.
Brexit, yes, it has been disastrous in many ways for unionism, but it's not the end of the story. And in fact, I think that maintaining the union, it's almost as if unionists have forgotten that they do have to maintain the union in some way.
We'll ask a panel of experts for their verdict on where unionism is on the debate and if there's a case for greater flexibility. And continuing the New Ireland theme, we peer into the future with comedians Conor Grimes and Alan McKee. Hello. How joined up is the thinking within unionism about the possibility of a border poll that gives the green light to constitutional change? There's no shortage of unionists who don't want to engage in the debate. Some don't even like the fact that it's happening at all. But there are those who feel unionism has to confront the reality of the changing political landscape on the island of Ireland, and the historian Aaron Edwards is one of them. Born and bred in Rathcoole, his latest book sets out to explain what unionism is, what its shortcomings might be, and what a more inclusive, forward-thinking unionism might look like.
Essentially, the world, the unionists, James Craig, the first Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, and his cabinet colleagues built was a very exclusive one. They were always, of course, perpetually on guard that what they had been bequeathed in the Government of Ireland Act and what had come about with the Boundary Commission settling the sort of border in a political sense between the London and Dublin and Belfast governments would be lost if they didn't maximise their position. So it led to many, many years of unionist dominance electorally, where they did do unpalatable things that, looking back in terms of discrimination, but more gerrymandering of electoral boundaries. I think that they were perhaps more insecure about the threat from within the sort of pro-union community, more so than the political opposition of the old Nationalist Party. And what I mean by that is that there were those who took a very different view of the dominant Unionist Party, independent Unionists, members of the Northern Ireland Labour Party, who really wanted Northern Ireland, in some senses, to be just as British as Finchley. But what happened was you had this world built up by the Unionist Party that really made its name on excluding people. And also, I should add, it was a part-time administration, full-time civil service, but part-time politicians who were very often very aloof and detached from their constituents and who didn't really need to engage in constituency-level management. They were returned regardless of who they were, and often we saw in electoral terms that people moved out and other people moved in without much of a flutter or even much knowledge of the everyday knowledge of the constituents. It was a very unusual place and very one-dimensional in its politics and its culture.
So what's the challenge for unionism as things currently stand? Because when you look at it, it appears to be fragmented, and it appears to be unsure whether its interests lie in being progressive or in being traditional.
Sure, and I think that unionism, is in two minds really about the best way forward. And as I, argue in my book, the two sort of traditions that you see there, one is based on a very Ulster-centric, Northern Ireland-centric political culture that looks outwards to the rest of the UK. And then you've got the other brand of unionism or tradition where it sees itself as an integral part of the UK and is just another one of the four nations. But the frameworks and the way in which people who consider themselves supporters of one brand of unionism or another, I think speaks to their own psychological and demographic position and where they find themselves. So just to build on that a little bit, culturally, I suppose we might refer to the first group as loyalists. And that would even include the DUP, actually, which of course is a Democratic Unionist Party, but sees the people as being, the Ulster people rather than necessarily the United Kingdom. It sees itself in a very different way and somewhat detached, I would argue. And then, of course, you get the more progressive elements where, the sorts of social norms would be more what you would get in England, for example, and they would very much want that adapted and adopted in Northern Ireland. So really, you've two very different worldviews there within unionism, and one has been dominant over another at different times, and I think it will ever be thus.
Did Brexit, in your view, fundamentally weaken unionism and therefore, by definition, the union too?
Well, of course, there has been a view taken for some time, even before Brexit and before the Brexit referendum, that the end of the union was inevitable, and analysts such as myself would refer to that as endism, that it's almost, it is inevitable no matter what way you look at it. Or another way to look at it might be that a united Ireland is inevitable. But really, I think there is a lot of agency there for unionists. They can, even though Brexit has proven a huge, again, psychologically difficult sort of political reality for unionists, I think they can move beyond that, and that has to do with whether unionists are actually in a position to adapt to changing political realities. And I suppose one way that I would emphasise this in relation to Brexit is that sovereignty and the unionists, and particularly the DUP's view of sovereignty, is very classical looking in this day and age, with globalization, with huge demographic changes that actually no longer tie itself to these traditional forms of the state and the way that it's organized. So I think that Brexit, yes, it has been disastrous in many ways for unionism, but it's not the end of the story. And in fact, I think that maintaining the union, it's almost as if unionists have forgotten that they do have to maintain the union in some way, that they have to sell it to the greater number of people, because ultimately that's how they secure the survival of the union long into the future.
So here we are on this side of Brexit now, which you say has been disastrous for unionism. There are increasingly loud demands for a debate about a border poll and unification. That conversation is happening, whether unionists like it or not. How should unionism, in your view, deal with that reality?
Well, as Professor Brendan O'Leary has put it recently, he would argue if he was giving advice to unionist political leaders, he would tell them not to engage in any kind of discussion at all.
And he told me that last week. He was very clear about that. If unionists asked him, he would say, don't engage with the debate. But he also says, and this is important as well, Aaron, isn't it? It is correct that the shape of how a border poll might happen and what any constitutional arrangements might look like is essential. That conversation has to happen, even if unionists don't engage with it, he says.
And that's absolutely sensible and correct. And I wouldn't disagree with Professor O'Leary. I've known him for some time and have engaged with his work. But I think that we really need to look at where Northern Ireland is at. And I think that, unfortunately, reconciliation has fallen away. The idea that the Good Friday Agreement really resolved a lot of the issues, I don't think that is the case. That really unionists should have engaged in a more responsible dialogue within their community and beyond it, and so we find ourselves in a very adversarial ground at the moment, and really a border poll without giving much thought to what that might look like and the sorts of discussion around, for example, losers' consent, which has been quite popular recently, or planning even for what a new Ireland might look like, I think would be, it is irresponsible. But I think for unionists, they don't have to necessarily engage in that. But what they can do is they can extol the virtues of what the union, as in the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the future of unionism should look like, and how that might appeal to a greater number of people. And that's the case that I've made in my book. I don't think that that's giving ground, or that's confident.
I just want to pick up on that idea of losers' consent for a moment or two more, because it's something I talked to Brendan O'Leary about last week. He gives the example of unionists being allowed, for example, to retain their British nationality in a new 32-county Irish state, and the option of Stormont maybe continuing as a devolved assembly for the 6 northeastern counties. I mean, how do you think unionism would feel about those concessions in a new political dispensation?
I would say there that the idea of consent is where you have buy-in, at least nominally. What we're really talking about here, I think, is conceding, and I can't see at least the more militant-minded within the unionist community. I've written extensively and talked about loyalism. Those people within loyalist communities and loyalist paramilitary groups are tied to paramilitary groups. They are not even in the neighbourhood for a conversation about a united Ireland, because they don't see that being realistic. And if it did, of course, then that's a very different set of circumstances that they will find themselves in.
So that's interesting, Aaron. Let me just ask you this. You have written about loyalist paramilitaries in the past. Which paramilitaries do you think in those circumstances would be turning to violence again? The groups that claim to have been on ceasefire for over 25 years and saying they're trying very hard to transition? Or would it be the criminal gangs that the police say use coercive powers to control the areas in which they operate? Who'd be doing the fighting, and who'd they be fighting against?
In terms of the armed actors, I think that the paramilitary groups are still in existence, but really we know that they're involved in a whole range of nefarious activities, even though they may be making the claim that they're transitioning towards something that even they don't know what. But so it's impossible to say with any kind of confidence what that would look like. But again, just to repeat some of the points that I've made about the old unionist state, they were terribly, terribly anxious, the leaders of the old unionist state, that loyalists, or what we would today call loyalists, didn't take the law into their own hands. And there's always been that element within militant loyalism, like militant republicanism, that if the circumstances were right, they would do that. And we've seen some indication of how that might go in and around the threats issued on the Northern Ireland Protocol, but really they've been short-lived. So I think that the biggest danger really is apathy and disenfranchisement, and rather than necessarily, a concerted insurgency that Professor O'Leary mentioned as one possible future option for that, militant community who feel left out and left behind. But I think apathy and political apathy is something that is alive and well within the unionist community, particularly in working class areas, and that should be a cause for concern for everyone.
Aaron Edwards there, and his book, A People Under Siege, is published by Merrion Press. Let's discuss some of the issues raised in that conversation now with my guests, Chris Donnelly, Patricia O'Lynn and Owen Polly. Welcome to all of you. Owen Polly, first of all, we talked there a lot in that conversation about broad cultural unionism and how it might adopt a more progressive, inclusive approach to this constitutional debate. If Aaron Edwards is right in his assessment, how does political unionism deliver on that?
It's a difficult question because, you're talking about two very different constituencies. The kind of cultural unionism, as we've discussed, or as Aaron Edwards was discussing, hasn't maybe been motivated to come out and vote for the unionist political parties, certainly at the last election. So the unionist parties basically have to find a way to reach those people. I don't think, we hear a lot of talk about this word progressive. It's been bandied about a lot. I think that word has become connected rather too much to some, sort of radical and rather divisive social policies. I think what the unionist parties really need to be aiming at is to be more sympathetic, to be seen as sane and sensible in all the issues that come up at Stormont and at Westminster.
Could you use another synonym there, which is inclusive? I mean, the word progressive is a word that Doug Beattie likes. Jeffrey Donaldson seems a bit less keen on it. But at the moment within political unionism, Jeffrey Donaldson very much has the whip hand, and he's not leading a party that appears to want to be particularly inclusive and progressive at this stage. I think that's fair to say. Would you agree?
I think that the DUP sort of vacillates in this. At times it speaks with a voice that's more inclusive, and at times it kind of goes back to those more traditionalist leanings. But I think, I mean, it would be wrong not to point out that the DUP has changed over the years, and it's not the party that we knew in the 80s and the 90s, even though sometimes it is portrayed as if it's that same kind of monolith. So I'm not of the opinion that, you know, there has to be a major realignment of the parties, that this is something that they should be focusing on, or that should be their prime kind of objective, is to look at whether they should realign. It should be more getting the basics right, speaking to people's concerns and needs, and, you know, always sounding sane, reasonable, moderate about whatever issues they're broaching.
We'll come on to realignment maybe in a moment or two. Can I just ask you before we bring in Patricia and Chris, do you think unionism should be engaging in this conversation, or do you think that makes it complicit in bringing about its own demise potentially?
Well, it depends the basis that unionism's engaging in the conversation. I mean, essentially, if unionism is refining its arguments for remaining in the United Kingdom, and as part of that process, broaching some of the arguments for an all-Ireland state and sort of arguing against those or presenting the counter-arguments, that's fine. But becoming embroiled in what is basically a campaign, however much people would like to portray it as something different, as something that's gained its own momentum, it's a campaign. If people are going to be indulging that campaign, they're going to be adding to the sort of sense of inevitability, or the sense that a border poll is coming and that there's a demand for it. So I don't really see the value in that.
So what are you saying? Prepare for the conversation, but don't take part in the debate just yet?
Well, you can certainly broach all the issues and engage in the conversation in that sense, and certainly engage in a sort of wider conversation about the constitutional issues. But, I mean, you don't want to be on your opponent's ground, as it were. It doesn't have to be on their terms. OK. Patricia Olin, you're not speaking as an Alliance Party representative tonight, though you have served as a councillor and an MLA for the party. I just want to ask you about Alliance and where it stands in all of this, where the centre ground stands in your view. If Alliance isn't unionist, is it, in your view, nonetheless pro-union? Because it effectively accepts the status quo.
No, I would say the Alliance Party is pro-Northern Ireland and pro-United Community. So the focus for the Alliance Party is not so much on looking at key issues through the constitutional lens, but at looking at the key issues and how we can be better as, you know, the place that is Northern Ireland by resolving, you know, healthcare, budget issues, all the rest. Like, from the Alliance perspective, introducing, you know, a border poll or conversations and moving towards conversations about the inevitability of a border poll are really just destabilising at a point where we need stability back, and we need to be dealing with the nuts or the bread and butter issues of Northern Ireland.
But does that not, by definition, make you unionist, at the very least pro-union? If you say you're pro-Northern Ireland and those issues that you've just outlined, should take preeminence over anything else, that effectively makes you a unionist party.
No, I wholeheartly disagree. Whenever we sign into the Assembly, we sign in as United Community, because that's what we believe in. We believe the community needs to be united before anything else. It hasn't been, it isn't, and as a result, the government's collapsed and people are suffering. So wholeheartedly, no, it's not a constitutional lens. We don't take a position in terms of the. But
by not taking a position to seek change, you are taking a position to keep things as they are. And if you keep things as they are, you're pro-union.
I don't think that's a logical assertion to make. I think
some people would think that was a logical interpretation of it. Chris, do you think
the electorate seems to think different whenever they come to vote for Alliance Party.
I understand that Alliance doesn't want to formally take a position, and again, you're not speaking for the Alliance Party tonight, but is it not de facto the case that if you don't seek change, you're happy with the status quo. And as part of the status quo, we're in the United Kingdom.
I mean, I think in terms of seeking change, the Alliance Party's got a pretty strong record.
On the constitutional issue. On the constitutional issue. That's what we're talking about.
But so, change in regards to the constitutional issue. So what gets sacrificed then? Is it education, more budget cuts there, or the healthcare system? What is it that we should sacrifice as a party?
Here's the thing, right? After an election, unionists are very quick to say that centre ground is effectively pro-union because it doesn't agree with change. Therefore, there's no call for a border poll. And if there was a border poll, there wouldn't be a vote for constitutional change. So unionists, indirectly at the very least, are claiming that alliance support is theirs.
I also wouldn't agree with that because I'm in touch with the voter base and I'm in touch with the party membership as well. And the people that I speak to on a regular basis and in detailed conversations believe in the right to determine your own identity. And that's what the Alliance Party is promoting.
But it is a fact that that's what unionist politicians say, because I've had the conversations with them and they've said it directly to me. You're saying they're wrong.
I think they're wrong, yeah.
But it is, you accept it's a fact that they claim that support.
I think it's an attempt, yeah, but I think that they're wrong. So.
And if it came down to it, as far as you're concerned, are you clear about where you would be at a time of a border poll, what your position would be? Because you've said you come from quite a complicated background as far as the constitutional issue is concerned. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but Catholic nationalist, but with a family connection to the British military?
Yeah, so no secrets about it. I'm very privileged, not really a complicated background, but I have a diverse family. I wrote recently in the Irish News about my grandfather being a Protestant Englishman that moved to Northern Ireland. He was a Marine during the World War and converted to Catholicism, but they were liberals at that stage as well. And I'm also really privileged to have mixed race marriages in my family. So growing up, I went to a Catholic grammar school and was bringing home probably a wee bit more Republican sentiment, and my parents were very good in saying, if that's your position, that's fine, but explain it to us. And they problematized it through the lens of unionism as well as, British military and all the nuances that come with it. So no, I would not be clear on where I stand, and I think I speak for a lot of people that would also say they're not clear on where they stand. And one of the things that stood out for me from Aaron's podcast and Red Lines was he used the phrase floating voters.
Yeah.
And I don't want to speak for my family, but definitely for myself and my household, that's where we would fall into.
So persuadable either way.
Persuadable either way. And let me say this, and I think this is what came across with the Alliance Party in North Antrim as well, that people still refuse to believe. There is significant and growing population of people who are not going to look at this through an emotive lens, through the past. They're looking at it through an economic perspective, through a standard of living perspective, and not just for themselves, but for the wider community, because people understand and are progressive enough to understand that society is complicated, social issues are complicated. If you can uplift your family and others, it benefits everybody. Okay. So we need to see more research and evidence. We talk about consent. Informed consent is the basis of actual consent. People need to understand what it is that they're voting for, and we've seen the fallout from Brexit when they don't. OK,
Chris, can I just ask you, first of all, as a nationalist, how you perceive that centre ground, that middle ground, that alliance support, which unionists say de facto means a vote for the status quo, because it isn't a vote for change. How do you read it?
Well, I read it as the votes that are in play. It's the votes that are in play between Owen's position being pro-union and my position being pro-unity.
So you see them as persuadables?
Oh, absolutely. And I don't think people can claim. The other thing I think we have to be very clear is it's not a block that's coherent that you can just label and say these people all believe one thing. In many ways, it's like nationalism and unionism. There are many strands within that. So there can be people who vote alliance who are actually quite strong in the union. There can now be people, I know a few of them, who would vote strongly in favour of Irish unity, but they're also alliance voters. So I think that's the point. They're persuadables. Where I would take issue just with something Patricia did say, and I think alliance are quite careful. I know you're not speaking in alliance capacity tonight, are quite careful not to say this. There was a reference to border poll being destabilising. I don't think that's true. And I think that the whole idea of having what, after all, is a central tenet of the Good Friday Agreement, that people can argue in favour of the status quo like Owen today, or people can lobby in favour of constitutional change. Yeah. That's not, to me, trying to close that down by saying you're destabilising society is fundamentally wrong.
Do you think it's destabilising, arguably, at the moment when clearly there wouldn't be, or it seems, if you look at the numbers, there wouldn't be the support there that would actually carry a border poll? And in fact, even some of those who are most ardently in favour of a border poll don't want to see it immediately.
No, I don't think there's anyone wants to see it immediately. What they're actually arguing for is that there should be a border poll at some point in the short to medium term.
What does that mean? What's short to medium term? What does that mean to you?
Personally, I think you have to have a period of planning beforehand. I'd be very happy with a border poll in the next 7 to 10 years, because you have to allow for a period of sufficient and credible planning to be in place for the very reasons of what we've just been through, the Brexit experience. We don't want that. For also some of the reasons that were discussed just at the beginning of the programme here, through the interview with the author, that there are principles that need to be discussed. The notion of loser's consent.
This is Brendan O'Leary's idea that we talked about last week.
Brendan O'Leary's idea, yes. And really, as an academic concept, it's okay. The very difficult matter is, however, in the Northern Irish context, many people would see that this could become something that gets remoulded into a new unionist veto, an undemocratic
Well, he was very
veto.
clear, it's not about a veto, it's about getting democratic consent from the losers to buy into whatever the arrangement is in future, by, for example,
but it's not
making that change acceptable to them. So, for example, keeping Stormont and allowing unionists to keep their British identity, that kind of thing.
Absolutely, and I'm in favour of all those.
Are
but
you?
The difficulty, personally, yes, I'm in favour of keeping Stormont. I've been quite open and written quite a lot saying the model of losers' consent that we're all existing under right now is the Good Friday Agreement, and the 3 strands were agreed. So that has to be, if that was good enough for nationalists, who, after all, negotiated that from the losers' point of view, the losers' consent to reside within the United Kingdom context, then that has to be the template from which, if there's going to be change from that, unionists are entitled to nothing less, but not entitled to anything more than what nationals have. And what the unfortunate situation at the moment is we have people like Ian Paisley coming out saying, no, you need to actually change the game completely, and there needs to be a supermajority for unity. And almost implicit in that is losers' consent means that unionists have a right to demand for it. That's fundamentally wrong.
Yeah, which is not the point that Professor O'Leary was making on the programme last week, and he was keen to clarify that. Can I ask you, Owen Polly, do you see demands for a border poll at the moment as destabilising?
I think without a doubt they're destabilising. And
what do you make of Chris's assertion that they're absolutely not destabilising, and he doesn't want to see a border poll for 7 to 10 years, and that's perfectly acceptable under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement?
Well, the fact that we're talking about this ad nauseum at the moment just proves how destabilising it's going to be. I mean, if we're going to declare that we're going to have a border poll in 5-7 years' time, we spend the entire time campaigning, discussing this, not getting on with other issues, not addressing problems that we've got with our society right
So
here,
because
right
it's
now.
uncomfortable for unionists, we shouldn't talk about it?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. It's by definition, it's basically destabilising. And once you actually pull the trigger in that border poll, once you say that that's what's going to happen, you start the campaigns, and then normal politics, every other kind of political agenda gets parked while the two sides go into campaign mode. And you're talking about, can we ever decide what's on offer?
Right. Well, maybe what you do then, if it's destabilising over a number of years, maybe what you do is you don't drag it out and you actually have the border poll sooner rather than later. And if that happened, of course, there'd be a much better chance of unionism knocking nationalism back.
Well, if you declared it tomorrow morning, I would say that you would find all of a sudden that a lot of nationalists wouldn't be so keen on
Well, then why don't you call it tomorrow morning? Why don't unionists support that? If that's the case, if you really believe that, why are unionists apparently so opposed to the idea of a border poll?
Well, I mean, that's not the proviso that was contained within the Belfast Agreement. We were to get a border poll once the Secretary of State was satisfied that a majority of people would probably vote for constitutional change.
You don't think that if a lot of unionists, high-powered unionists, went to the Secretary of State and said, actually, do you know what, we'd be quite keen to get this border poll, you don't think he would listen to that?
Well, I don't think that's the way to go about things. I think it's, I'm not sure that he actually would in the case of this particular Secretary of State.
Let me bring Patricia in. Is it destabilising? And does Owen have a point that because it's causing uncertainty, we should stop talking about it and we should think about some of the other issues that are maybe more pressing?
I absolutely think Owen has a point, and I think the key point to be made is the key pressing issue is getting the institutions up and running again. Let's focus on that. Let's not focus on a border poll. Let's focus on getting the people that were elected in to serve and govern the people of Northern Ireland and resolve the issues that people are facing day and daily. I mean, appreciate the points that you're making in terms of the purpose of the Good Friday Agreement, but the purpose of it was surely not to create the impasse that we're in at the minute. So yeah, I think the point's valid.
Okay, there's a quick point I want to bring up, and it's relevant given another conversation that we're not directly talking about tonight, but that is certainly part of the public debate, and that's about commemorations. Do you see a time in a new Ireland in the future when IRA commemorations could become state events in a united Ireland along the lines of the Civil War commemorations we currently see? Is that what we're heading towards potentially?
I think that where we're heading towards, never mind in a new Ireland, but in the current today, is a place where people acknowledge that there has to be, whether there's United Ireland or United Kingdom, for instance, from my perspective, I respect the fact that people will want to commemorate loved ones from within their own community who served in the RUC, served in the UDR, the B Specials, the British Army. That is at the moment when we're in the United Kingdom, and if we were in United Ireland, I still believe people in this part of Ireland would certainly want to continue to do that. And believing that to be the case, then I think people are entitled from within the nationalist community to say, well, there needs to be a degree of space and a place provided for those within the Republican tradition who seek to do the same.
Even if that is unsettling for unionism, as it demonstrably has been over the last few days?
There's the problem right there. What we call earlier on having a conversation about Irish unity is causing instability within unionism. Okay. People within my tradition commemorating the dead is unsettling. That's the issue. It's that entitlement mentality within unionism is what needs to be tackled now, because it's an obstacle to equality.
All right, got to leave it there. No, we're out of time, I'm afraid. I'm sorry, we'll come back and we'll talk about it again. I have no doubt we need to leave it there for now. Thanks all very much indeed. And by the way, there's a longer version of that conversation with Aaron Edwards on this week's Red Lines podcast. As always, you can find it on BBC Sounds or wherever you get your podcasts.